Good afternoon. I'm Mike Kaczynski, Project Manager with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I'd like to welcome you to the FSMA Final Rule on requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, otherwise known as the Food Traceability Rule. In today's event, if you would look down in the description, you will find additional resources on how you can submit questions, as well as a wealth of other information that would be very beneficial to you throughout today's presentations. I'd like to now hand it over to Adrian Dukes, a health communication specialist at ORA, who will kick things off. Adrian, take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Dukes, a health communication specialist in FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, Division of Communications, Public Affairs Branch. I'd like to welcome you to today's FSMA Chat. Our presenters today are Jessica Koshin, Melanie Mayor, and Asma Madad. Jessica Koshin is a case review specialist in ORA's Office of Policy, Compliance, and Enforcement in the Division of Compliance and Enforcement. She joined the Traceability Workgroup to help draft the final rule and will be part of Phase 2 implementation of the rule with a specific focus on compliance and enforcement. Captain Melanie Mayor serves as a special assistant to ORA's Office of Human and Animal Foods Operations West Program Director. Captain Mayor served as a traceability sub-workgroup co-lead for Phase 1 implementation and enforcement workgroup. Asma Madad is a senior biologist who has been a part of Response Team 2 and CIF-SAN's Office of Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation Core Network since 2015. She is currently one of 3 FDA co-leads for implementation efforts related to the Food Traceability Rule. Today's chat will focus on the FSMA Final Rule on requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, which establishes traceability record-keeping requirements beyond those in existing regulations for persons who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods included on the Food Traceability List. We will also have a panel consisting of Angela Fields, a Senior Consumer Safety Officer, and Sharon Silman, biologist, who are both members of the Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation Network. The panel will answer questions that were submitted during the registration process. As a reminder, this chat is intended for federal and state regulators only.
Thank you, Adrian. And now I'll hand it over to Jessica Koshin, Case Review Specialist with ORA. Jessica, take it away.
Hello. Today we'll be covering an overview of the Food Traceability Final Rule found in 21 CFR Subpart S, which starts at 1.1300. The Food Traceability Final Rule establishes new record-keeping requirements for persons who manufacture, process, pack, or hold certain foods, those which are on a list called the Food Traceability List, or FTL. Additional record-keeping requirements are necessary to help FDA rapidly and effectively identify and remove potentially contaminated food. The final rule covers the entire food supply chain, including retail food establishments, restaurants, and farms, and applies to domestic firms as well as foreign firms producing food for U.S. consumption. The full list of exemptions is stated in the final rule. Exemptions are summarized here on the slide and grouped together. Please note that some of the things listed here are partially exempt from the rule, while others are fully exempt. I'm not going to walk through the exemptions in detail today, but you can see there are exemptions for several different groupings of entities, such as farms, fishing vessels, and restaurants. I want to make sure that you're aware that we've developed an online tool to help you determine whether an exemption to the rule may apply to a particular situation. A screenshot of the rule is here. This tool takes you step by step through the exemptions in the final rule and provides information about whether a particular situation means an entity is fully exempt from the rule, partially exempt, or is not exempt. And you can access this tool on our website at the Food Traceability Final Rule page. Here is the Food Traceability List, or FTL. The rule applies only to foods on the FTL, including foods containing listed foods as ingredients, as long as the ingredient is in the same form as what appears on the list, for example, fresh. If you look on our website, you'll see descriptions of each commodity, including examples of foods that are and are not considered part of certain commodity designations on the FTL. So for example, tropical tree fruits are further defined and examples of different cheeses are provided. There are some additional things to know about whether a food is covered by the rule. For example, for foods that are specified as fresh on the FTL, only the fresh version of the commodity is covered by the final rule. So for example, fresh melons and fresh herbs. If a food that is designated on the FTL as fresh is used in its fresh form as part of a multi-ingredient food, then the multi-ingredient food would also be covered under the final rule. So for example, bagged salad mix containing fresh lettuce or a prepared sandwich containing fresh tomatoes would be covered. If the food is changed to a form that's not on the FTL, for example, by drying it or freezing it, then the food would no longer be covered by the rule. So for example, fresh spinach, fresh herbs, and fresh peppers are on the list and covered by the rule, but frozen spinach, dried peppers, and dried herbs would not be covered by the rule. For foods on the FTL that are not designated as fresh, if those FTL foods are used as ingredients in a multi-ingredient food, then that multi-ingredient food is covered by the final rule. So for example, again, peanut butter in a sandwich cracker for which no kill step is applied to either the finished peanut butter or the peanut butter sandwich cracker itself will be covered by the rule. But if a firm applies a kill step to a food on the FTL, the requirements of the final rule would not apply to the firm's subsequent shipment of that food or to anyone else who handles that food after the firm ships it. The firm, however, must maintain a record of their application of the kill step. So one example of this would be canned tomatoes. Next, I want to talk about the foundational framework of the rule. The Food Traceability Final Rule identifies key points along the supply chain where it is most important to collect traceability information. These are called critical tracking events, or CTEs. And they include the points where food is harvested and cooled, initially packed for agricultural commodities, first received on land from a fishing vessel for seafood, transformed, shipped, and received. At each CTE, or again, critical tracking event, we're requiring traceability information essential to understand what happened to the food at that point. These are called key data elements, or KDEs. This approach really standardizes traceability information across the entire food supply chain. Importantly, the records required at those critical tracking events, or CTEs, would need to contain and link the traceability lock code of that food to the other relevant KDEs, or key data elements. A firm's role and activities in the supply chain will determine which KDEs they must keep and share. This example shows a generic supply chain for fresh produce, which will be sold at retail. For example, this could be fresh cucumbers, fresh tomatoes, or fresh leafy greens. You can see the specific KDEs required to be kept at each critical tracking event in the supply chain. In some instances, one entity may conduct multiple critical tracking events. For example, the initial packer of fresh lettuce would be required to keep pieces of information pertaining to that initial packing event. Since that same entity also most likely ships the food to the next point in the supply chain, that entity would also keep KDEs required under the shipping CTE. The shipping CTE also identifies those KDEs that must be sent to the person receiving the shipment of food. Since all of these entities in this example are covered by the rule, each entity, including the farm, would also need to maintain a traceability plan, which I will discuss a little bit later. To drill down a little deeper on this example, this slide shows an example for what is to be expected for an entity that performs initial packing as outlined in the rule. There are a few caveats though. One, the KDEs that are listed on this slide and other slides in this presentation are just a summary of the required KDEs. They're not the precise KDEs within the rule. You can find those in the final rule on our website. And second, this example does not apply to food obtained from a fishing vessel. The initial packing KDEs encompass both the first and second column on this slide. The left column contains the initial packing KDEs that relate to the incoming raw agricultural commodity. Each KDE should be linked to each traceability lot that gets packed. This means that for each data element, a firm should be able to identify the corresponding lot using the traceability lot code. Firms will keep information about what products are coming in, how much, when, and where it came from, with some additional information about harvesting and cooling, which will be provided by the harvester and the cooler to the initial packer. And then, as shown in the middle column on this slide, information will also be kept about the packing process, such as when and where the food was packed, how much was packed, and what traceability lot code was assigned. Since all of the information in both these first two columns is kept for each traceability lot, the information will all be linked together. So that information is available about the incoming raw agricultural commodities that become part of a traceability lot. Similar information is captured for shipping, which is a separate CTE. Most of the shipping KDEs need to be sent to the next person in the supply chain, but the initial packer KDEs do not need to be sent forward. We developed an interactive online tool that identifies the KDEs required for each CTE within the final rule. This tool can be found on our website. This framework of CTEs and KDEs allows us to standardize the information that industry maintains and shares for traceability across the food supply chain. This helps FDA more quickly identify and go back to entities within the supply chain. Requiring traceability lot codes to be kept and shared along the supply chain is also critical to be able to track the movement of food by lot code. This can help FDA to avoid issuing overly broad recalls, as has sometimes been done in the past, which can help limit the adverse impacts on industry sectors affected by these outbreaks. Records required under the final rule need to be provided to FDA within 24 hours of a request or within some reasonable time to which FDA has agreed. This standardized information, as well as requiring records to be provided within 24 hours, can lead to faster identification and rapid removal of potentially contaminated food from the market, resulting in fewer foodborne illnesses and deaths. The goal of the traceability rule is to ensure KDEs can be maintained across the supply chain for more efficient and effective tracing, while providing firms flexibility within their existing tracing systems. The final rule specifies what records must be kept, but not how they are kept. The traceability lot code is an integral component of the traceability requirements. It links to the other KDEs required, including the TLC source, which provides the physical location for where the traceability lot code for an FTL food was assigned. Obtaining the traceability lot code and traceability lot code source enables FDA to get to that source faster, going to the points in the chain that handle the product and assign a traceability lot code in order to get to a possible source of contamination more efficiently. Another requirement is that every entity covered by the rule must maintain a traceability plan, as I had mentioned, which describes a firm's traceability procedures and will help us understand how a firm is maintaining the required records and identifying the FTL foods that they handle. This requirement applies to farms as well, even if they do not have to maintain any KDEs. Finally, working with supply chain partners is critical to firms maintaining traceability in their supply chain. The requirements specify the information that not only needs to be maintained by the firm, but shared by that firm with the next firm in the supply chain. Records can be maintained as either original paper records, electronic records, or true copies. They need to be maintained for 2 years. They need to be made available to FDA within 24 hours of a request, or again within some reasonable time to which FDA has agreed. And in certain circumstances, FDA can require that information be provided to us in an electronic sortable spreadsheet. These situations would include when it's necessary to help prevent or mitigate a foodborne illness outbreak, to assist in the implementation of a recall, or to otherwise address a threat to public health. The electronic sortable spreadsheet would not be requested during a routine inspection. However, the request could be made by phone. The compliance date for all entities is January 20th, 2026, 3 years. This provides industry the time to coordinate effective implementation of the rule and collaborate as needed on tracing systems. And consistent with our approach for other FSMA rules, FDA intends to take the approach of educating before and while we regulate. Once the compliance date has passed, we intend to use our standard regulatory inspection tools, including discussing violations at the time of our review of records, to inform covered entities of violations of the rule as they are observed, and to provide firms with a reasonable opportunity to comply.
Thank you, Jessica, for a great high-level interview. The next several slides is directed towards FDA's webpage. A wealth of information can be through FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act and rules-related programs. The Food Traceability Final Rule landing page includes translations into several languages: Spanish, Indonesian, Simplified Chinese, Thai, and Vietnamese. Through the webpage, 21 CFR Part 1, Subpart S can be accessed a couple ways, either through the Federal Register, which also includes the agency's response to more than 500 public comments, or through the electronic CFR. For those who are technically savvy, on the left side of the online versions includes a table of contents with a navigational tool to the headings within the document. Another way to navigate through the browser or large document is using the keyboard shortcut search function by holding the Control key and then the F key, allowing to find words and phrases quickly. As you scroll down the web page, there are headings such as the Food Traceability List, also known as the FTL, key features, full and partial exemptions, etc. When any of the headings is selected, a drop-down of additional information will appear. So to the right of this slide is an example of what is displayed in the FTL. Note the hyperlinks that redirects to other web pages. The dedicated FTL web page contains additional description of the foods, the development of the FTL, the risk ranking model, and an explanation of updates to the FTL, and a full list of references. In the interest of time, I will skip some of the features, key features, exemptions, and CTEs and KDEs. However, I would encourage you to visit those sections to learn more. As you can see, there are some supply chain examples. There are some for produce, seafood, and cheese. So those include video presentations, transcripts, which have been translated into several languages, as well as slides with helpful visuals. And Jessica had gone over a visual for the produce supply chain example. And additional supply chain examples may be developed, so please visit the web page as new information may be added. The frequently asked questions section directs another to another web page that is interactive. There is a navigational tool on topics ranging from the FTL through retail food establishments and restaurants to the traceability law code. Within the web page, there is a search function for word or phrase, as well as the Excel export function. This webpage may also be updated based on feedback from the ongoing outreach, so please visit the webpage as new information is added. The next heading, stakeholder calls, webinars, and meeting links to previously recorded videos. There's a 30-minute video with stakeholders from November 2022 announcing the release of the Food Traceability Final Rule and a general overview, followed by a 3-hour public webinar from December 2022 sharing more details of the rule as well as a Q&A session. And a slide deck is available for download on that webpage. So after reviewing the materials and you still have some questions, please feel free to submit those inquiries through the FSMA Technical Assistance Network, also known as TAN. If you are approached for meetings or speaking engagements regarding the traceability rule, please direct those requests through the Contact Us section of this webpage. There is a specific email on the form itself, which is FSMA 204 traceability@fda.hhs.gov. And we certainly welcome presenters to assist with outreach and using our master slide deck and support from our SMEs. Lastly, the additional information, I just wanted to point out a couple of links that are to short documents. Those are referencing the retail food establishments and restaurants. What records do I need to keep? What you need to know about the traceability rule, and what do you need to know about the traceability plan. So that concludes our general overview of the FDA's Food Traceability Rule and available resources. I would be remiss without acknowledging the leadership from Katie Verk, from CIPSAN, Rebecca Buckner, Chris Waldrop, Caitlin Monahan, Rebecca Goldberg, Aaliyah Sassi, Bradley Brown, Brian Pendleton, Angela Fields, Alita Flores, and then many thanks to the numerous representatives across the agency for this milestone in enhancing food traceability. So we appreciated the opportunity to speak with you, and we hope you have an enjoyable one. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce Asma Madad, who will cover the Food Traceability Final Rule implementation update.
Thank you, Melanie, for the introduction. So as indicated, I'll be covering an update on implementation related to the Food Traceability Rule. So what I would first like to start with is just a high-level overview of the FSMA regulation implementation continuum. What you heard earlier in this presentation was the work of the Phase 1 group, which are tasked with basically developing the regulations, policy, and guidance if needed. So I'll be discussing in a little more detail implementation planning, which is the Phase 2 of the FSMA implementation continuum. And the goal for Phase 2 is to design strategies to promote overall compliance with the rules, as well as identifying performance metrics to measure success. And part of implementation planning, as I'll go into, includes education and training, and stakeholder engagement and outreach, among other things. So the final phase, if you will, is the eventual operationalization of the rule and continual evaluation of its success. So what I also wanted to cover specific to the Food Traceability Rule is not only the relationship between Phase 1 and Phase 2, but also the relationship to the new era of modern food safety blueprint, and specifically Core Element 1. So as I already mentioned, Phase 1 is really tasked with the rule writing. So the actual Food Traceability Rule and the Food Traceability List development. And they continue and have been doing outreach on rule requirements. And as also mentioned, if there's a need, they would be developing guidance. And as indicated, Phase 2 is tasked with implementation planning. And as I touched upon earlier, that encompasses education and training, the strategy for inspections and compliance, and it can also encompass IT development. So as mentioned, the new era of modern food safety blueprint, which some of you may have already heard, includes a tech-enabled traceability component. And the Food Traceability Rule provides a foundation for the work that New Era Core Element 1 is pursuing. However, New Era sees traceability beyond the rule requirements because that is what is ultimately needed to protect public health. So as an example, although the final rule does not require the use of electronic tracing records, FDA intends to work collaboratively with the food industry to explore ways to encourage firms to voluntarily adopt tracing technologies and ways to harmonize tracing activities. This would support interoperability across a variety of technology solutions that could work across all industry sectors. That being said, FDA does not endorse any specific technology, solution, or business, but we strongly support industry working together towards innovation. So back to the FSMA Phase 2 workgroup, what I wanted to highlight on this slide is the specific charge that was given by the FSMA Phase 2 Steering Committee to the workgroup. And as mentioned, this is to develop a multi-year implementation plan for the final rule to include some of the topic areas or tasks that I mentioned earlier. And I'll go into a little more detail later on in this presentation. So what I have on this slide here is a proposed workgroup structure for Phase 2. So what you see in the 5 green boxes indicate the particular sub-workgroups under the overall workgroup. And beneath those 5 green boxes are blue boxes indicating particular topic areas or considerations. This is by no means a final workgroup structure, and of course it can evolve as we continue through implementation planning. So in the next few slides, I'll cover some of these sub-workgroup considerations in a little more detail. So I wanted to start with the Inspections and Compliance Operations sub-workgroup. So as part of development of the inspection and compliance strategy or approach for this rule, this strategy will need to take both routine and directed domestic and foreign inspections into consideration. A particularly important part of the strategy is how the agency will interact with our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners related to compliance and enforcement of the rule, given, as we just heard, retail food establishments, restaurants, and farms may be subject to the requirements of the rule. We will be looking at the work done by other FSMA programs for lessons learned and or best practices related to implementation activities. The inspection and compliance strategy, for example, will include tasks such as development of inspection protocols, inspection citations to facilitate data capture, as well as development of compliance programs and or assignments. Another proposed sub-work group relates to information technology. So in accordance with Section 204 of FSMA, we intend to establish a product tracing system for the receipt of food traceability information. We are also actively working on developing a way for stakeholders to submit requested traceability information to FDA, most likely through a portal which will allow firms to upload records or electronic sortable spreadsheets of information requested while protecting confidentiality of this information. This group will also look into assessing additional FDA IT system requirements and or needs. There already has been a significant amount of outreach and stakeholder engagement related to the rule that the Phase 1 group has been doing and continues to be involved in. As we move closer to the compliance date in 2026, the outreach and engagement related in particular to the compliance and inspection strategy, once developed, will be of significant importance for FDA stakeholders, state and other regulatory partners, and industry both in the domestic and international side of things. As with other FSMA rules, education and training development is a key component of implementation planning. And we anticipate development of both regulator and industry training. This could include working with external vendors to develop training materials in addition to using agency resources for training development. And finally, metrics development is a key component of any implementation plan. as mentioned in earlier slides, development of performance goals to measure and continually evaluate successful implementation and later operationalization is critical for all regulations. So as far as progress and next steps related for implementation related to this rule, we continue to work across the foods program to build out the plan for implementation, which will result in a finalization of the plan and timelines for overall implementation of the rule and the stand-up of work groups or sub-work groups as discussed to finalize tasks and milestones for specific topic areas. And of course, continued outreach and stakeholder engagement as we proceed through the implementation process is also a critical next step. So with that, I wanted to thank my implementation co-leads, Melinda Heyman and Brian Yon, the FSMA Phase 2 Steering Committee, and of course the Phase 1 group, and all the food program experts that continue to contribute to the development of the implementation plan for the traceability rule. And as already alluded to in the previous part of the presentation, following this session, please feel free to submit any additional questions through the FSMA chat or any speaker requests using the speaker request form and or submit any other inquiries to the FSMA 204 mailbox. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and happy to take questions as time allows. Thank you.
Hello, we are now moving into the question and answer portion of our program. My name is Jennifer Thomas. I'm a senior advisor in the Office of the Center Director and the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at FDA, and I'll be the moderator for this Q&A session. So before we get started with the Q&A, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Asma Madad, who you just met as one of our Phase 2 leads. We have Sharon Seelman, who is with CORE, and she is the project manager for New Era Core Element 1. And we have Angela Fields, who is also with CORE, and she is one of our Phase 1 leads. So let's get into our questions. So I'll start with some of our general background questions. First has to do with why is the Food Traceability Rule needed, since the Bioterrorism Act already requires record keeping for traceability? Angela, you want to take this one?
Thanks, Jennifer. So the background section of the preamble provides some information on the need for this regulation. And since 2004, adoption of the Subpart J record keeping requirements, which allows the agency to identify the immediate previous sources and immediate subsequent recipients of foods, which is commonly referred to as one up, one back. FDA has learned that the one up, one back record keeping requirements in Subpart J did not capture all of the data elements necessary to effectively and rapidly link shipments of food through each point in the supply chain. So among these significant gaps in Subpart J, the requirements were some of the following. So we noticed the lack of coverage for all sectors involved in food production, distribution, and sales. So farms and restaurants are exempt under Subpart J. The lack of uniform data collection, and then also an inability to link incoming product with outgoing product within a firm and from one point in the supply chain to the next. So recognizing the need for improvement in food traceability, in Section 204D1 of FSMA, Congress directed the agency to adopt additional record-keeping requirements to prevent and mitigate foodborne illness outbreaks and address threats of serious adverse health consequences or death.
So our next question is, what data do you have that will support the statement, it will allow for faster identification and more rapid removal of potentially contaminated food from the market, resulting in fewer foodborne illnesses?
So in support of the rulemaking under FSMA Section 204D and the associated regulatory impact analysis, FDA provided a traceback case study to illustrate the impact of enhanced record keeping through maintenance of lot codes to document traceback efficiencies. And this case study demonstrated that access to lot codes and other key data elements throughout the supply chain would likely enable FDA to identify common product sources more swiftly. So the maintenance of these KDEs will enable regulators to quickly identify sources of product and remove it from the marketplace, as well as reduce exposures and additional illnesses from the contaminated product, and to help investigate the contamination event.
All right, great, thank you. And one more question in the general section. What feedback has FDA received on the FTR?
So based on the preamble, FDA received approximately 1,100 comment submissions on the proposed rule. FDA received comments from consumers, from consumer groups, trade organizations, farmers and industry like food manufacturers, processors, distributors, and then also public health organizations and state and local governments and organizations and others as well. And there was both general support for and opposition to the proposed rule. Since December 2022, FDA has conducted over 35 speaking engagements to both internal and external stakeholders, and overall the meetings have been pretty positive, with some requesting further clarification on topics or situational scenarios. So we definitely would welcome feedback on your interactions with stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Angela. Next, we're going to move to a question about recalls. So how will the FSMA Food Traceability Rule be incorporated into handling recalls at state or multi-state level? So Ozma, this question for you.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. So just as a reminder, the final rule states that covered entities must make all records required under Subpart S available to an authorized FDA representative upon request within 24 hours or within some reasonable time to which FDA has agreed after the request, along with any information needed to understand these records. So in addition, the final rule has specific provisions that only take effect when there is a threat to public health, such as a foodborne illness outbreak or a recall. In those situations, the rule specifies that the 24-hour time period for producing records can begin with a remote request from FDA, such as a request by phone. Also, FDA can request that the required information be submitted in the form of an electronic sortable spreadsheet. The overall compliance and inspection strategy for the final rule, including incorporation into state or multi-state recalls, is still under development. We plan to provide more clarity in the near future, and we also plan to actively engage with both internal and external stakeholders in order to accomplish development of the plan for implementation.
Great, thank you. So the next question series is related to the retail elements of the rule. So we'll start with, what FTR requirements will retail food establishments need to meet? Angela?
So the record keeping requirements under the rule depend on the activity, what we're calling critical tracking events or CTEs, and those are being conducted by the regulated entity. Generally, the retail food establishment and restaurants must maintain receiving records as described in the rule. So in most cases, the rule requires that most of the KDEs be sent to the RFE or restaurant by the entity that ships the food. With regards to the FTL foods that RFEs transform and sell directly to consumers, such as a fresh salad prepared in a restaurant kitchen and then sold to a restaurant consumer, the rule states that the transformation KDEs do not apply to RFEs in restaurants with respect to foods they do not ship, so foods they sell or send directly to consumers. However, an entity such as a central kitchen that transforms the food and ships it to a business, such as a restaurant or RFE must keep the required records. And finally, RFEs and restaurants covered by this rule must establish and maintain a traceability plan. We also have additional resources for RFEs and restaurants, which are available on FDA's traceability landing page, and you can look under the additional information tab.
Great. So one other question related to the requirements for retail food establishments. What exemptions does the FTR have for retail establishments?
So certain entities under the rule may be either fully exempt, meaning they are not subject to the rule at all, or partially exempt, meaning they have reduced requirements under the rule. There is a full exemption for RFEs in restaurants with an average annual monetary value of food sold or provided during the previous 3-year period of no more than $250,000 on a rolling basis. And this is adjusted for inflation using the 2020 as the baseline year for calculating that adjustment. There also are partial exemptions where RFEs in restaurants, such as when a food is purchased directly from the farm where it was produced. In this situation, the RFE or restaurant is exempt from the rule with respect to that purchase, except that they need to record the name and address of the farm and must maintain that record for 180 days. There is also an exemption that applies to ad hoc purchases made by RFEs or restaurants from another RFE or restaurant. Another partial exemption in the rule is if the retail food establishment or restaurant has an average annual monetary value of food sold or provided during the previous 3-year period of no more than $1 million. In that case, they do not have to provide the requested information to FDA in an electronic sortable spreadsheet, and in the situations where they may otherwise be required.
Great, thank you, Angela. So next we have several questions received related to the implementation of the FTR in the retail setting. So some of the questions were related to the role of the local retail food inspector, what implementation and enforcement look like at the retail level, and FDA's plans for engaging our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. So I'll send that question over to Ashma.
Yeah, we know there have been and continue to be many questions surrounding the compliance and inspection strategy for the final rule, particularly as it relates to the retail food establishments, restaurants, and farms, and how our state, local, tribal, and territorial regulatory partners will be involved, availability of training, how existing contracts and/or cooperative agreements might change. We're currently considering the best approach for structuring and conducting records inspections under this rule, and we plan to work with our state, local, tribal, and territorial and other regulatory partners to implement efficient enforcement of the rule, including coordinating actions or deferring to each other when a particular agency is best suited to act swiftly to protect consumers. We intend to continue to leverage existing partnerships and agreements, clarify oversight responsibilities, reduce redundancy, and consider all tools that will promote effective implementation of the rule. And we hope to provide more information to our stakeholders as we work through implementation planning.
Great, thank you. So next we'll move to a few questions related to importers and imported foods. So the first question is, what is the impact to importers of food and feed products from the Food Traceability Rule? So Angela?
So the Food Traceability Rule applies the same to both overseas firms as well as domestic firms. The final rule applies to all persons who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the Food Traceability List, including any importer who physically handles FTL foods. There is no animal feed that is listed on the FTL, and persons who do not physically possess the food offered for import are not engaged in holding of the food within the meaning of the rule. So this means that some persons who are part of the importation process may not be subject to the rule because they do not hold the food. For example, a person who coordinates the importation of a food on the FTL but never takes physical possession of that food would not be subject to the rule, while a person who imports a listed food and physically possesses the food would be subject to the rule unless another exemption applies. Also, entities covered by the rule may designate entities that are not covered, such as importers or brokers who do not hold the food, to maintain traceability records on behalf of the covered entity. And this is outlined in section 1.1455B. But the covered entity would remain responsible for ensuring that the subpart S requirements are met for the food that they manufacture, process, pack, or hold, and the covered entity is responsible for ensuring that the records can be retrieved and provided on site within 24 hours of a request for official review. We at the FDA are encouraging the U.S. importers to work with their foreign suppliers to ensure that there is an understanding of the traceability requirements for the foods that are going to be exported into the U.S.
So how will this final rule impact the imports program and specifically FSVP? So Angela, will you start?
Sure. So for food importers who would be subject to the final rule would establish requirements that would be additional to the FSVP requirements. So while this final rule focuses on improving traceability for both domestic and foreign foods on the FTL, the FSVP regulation is intended to help ensure that importers can take certain steps to verify before importing the food that the imported food meets the applicable FDA food safety requirements.
And this is Asma, and maybe I can add to what Angela just said. So while the final rule does not require importers of FTL foods or foods on the food traceability list to verify that entities in their supply chain are in compliance with the subpart S requirements as a condition of importation, however, importers may wish to be aware of whether their suppliers are subject to and in compliance with subpart S requirements, because under Section 801A4 of the FD&C Act, an article of food is subject to refusal of admission if it appears that the requirements under Subpart S have not been met for that food. I will note that we are still determining our approach to enforcement of the Subpart S requirements and the appropriate circumstances regarding refusal of admission for noncompliance with the rule.
Great, thank you both. So now we'll move to a few questions around technology. So we'll start with a question for Sharon. What do you see on the horizon for advancements in low-cost technologies to assist in traceability?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, there has been a lot of impressive innovation in this area from the technology sector, and we are expecting that with FDA-defined data elements now in place, innovation in this area will only increase, providing more affordable solutions for businesses of all types in the supply chain. As part of FDA's new era of Smarter Food Safety Initiative, we did sponsor a low-cost, no-cost tech-enabled traceability challenge to encourage technology providers, public health advocates, entrepreneurs, and innovators from all disciplines to develop low to no-cost traceability solutions to help enable food operations of all sizes to participate in traceability efforts in a scalable, cost-effective way. There were 90 submissions from around the world, and the top 12 performing teams were highlighted during the October 2021 webinar. Now we are currently in the process of developing additional educational resources that build upon the learnings from that challenge, and FDA does not endorse any specific solution, technology, or business related to the challenge and the traceability rule. Also, under FDA's new era of Smarter Food Safety Initiative, we will continue to explore ways to encourage all entities in the supply chain to adopt tracing technologies and also harmonize tracing activities to support end-to-end traceability through the food safety system.
Great, thank you, Sharon. So this question is for you, Angela. How does the Food Traceability Rule apply to firms that don't have the means for sophisticated or technology-enhanced record keeping?
Great question. So although we encourage all parts of industry to adopt electronic record keeping for traceability, it is not a requirement, and firms may maintain original paper records or true copies such as photocopies, pictures, scanned copies, or other accurate reproductions of the original records. We'll continue to develop and disseminate outreach and training materials to stakeholders that focus on various industry segments and materials specifically targeted to smaller covered entities. We did want to note, though, that covered entities can work with supply chain partners in the 3-year time frame before the compliance date to understand how information will flow forward through the supply chain and then work out any agreements or protocols for how information will be shared among entities. Entities covered by the rule may designate entities that are not covered to maintain traceability records on their behalf, and this arrangement must be included in the firm's traceability plan. You also should know that the final rule does not require covered entities to adopt new technologies to meet their Subpart S requirements. So while we recognize that some firms may want to invest in certain technological tools or systems, not all firms want to or are financially able to do so. So the final rule provides firms with considerable flexibility in how they can meet their requirements, including the ability to keep records in paper or electronic form and to use existing records to the extent that they contain required information. And this is outlined in section 1.1455A and F of the final rule. So we recognize that covered entities vary widely in their traceability procedures and practices, and that coming into compliance with Subpart S might have a greater financial impact on certain entities, especially the smaller ones. So consequently, the final rule fully exempts certain smaller entities from Subpart S and exempts others from the requirement to provide an electronic sortable spreadsheet, which would contain the requested traceability information in certain circumstances.
All right, thank you, Angela. So next question is related to outreach and education. Will we receive specific guidance on how to educate firms in the interim period leading up to the compliance date? So Asma?
Thanks for that question. So similar to other FSMA regulations and what you heard earlier in the presentation, educate before and while we regulate is a key component of the compliance and inspection strategy for the final traceability rule. We plan to provide more clarity as to what materials and talking points will be available for regulators to accomplish this in the near future. And as this presentation also reviewed, there are currently resources on the traceability webpage which will be beneficial to industry to be shared.
Great. And then one more question in that same vein. What is the timing of international outreach materials development and deployment?
So FDA is currently considering an international outreach program that combines education as well as outreach materials on both the final traceability rule and New Era Core Element 1, which is tech-enabled traceability. This concept is in clearance and more details will be available at a later time. But as referenced in the earlier presentation, there are a lot of the information related to the food traceability rule includes translations in several languages, including Spanish, Indonesian, Simplified Chinese, Thai, and Vietnamese.
Great, thank you. All right, so the last question that we'll tackle today is related to enforcement. So who will be enforcing compliance with the traceability rule? So Asma?
Thanks for the question. So as alluded to earlier in the presentation, once the compliance date arrives, we do expect to conduct routine records inspections to ensure that entities subject to Subpart S are satisfying these requirements. Routine record inspections primarily will focus on an understanding of an entity's Subpart S record-keeping practices, identifying any gaps in compliance, and achieving compliance through prompt voluntary corrective actions if we observe deficiencies. Obviously, in situations like a foodborne illness outbreak or recall or other food safety emergency, the FDA may request specific Subpart S records from covered entities to facilitate the trace back or trace forward. And as mentioned earlier, we are still currently considering the best approach for structuring and conducting records inspections under this rule, understanding that we will need to work closely with our state, local, tribal, and territorial and other regulatory partners to implement efficient enforcement of this rule and coordinate best or ensure we aren't duplicating efforts.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And thank you all very much for participating in this Q&A session.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, for joining us on the FSMA Final Rule on requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, the Food Traceability Rule. I want to thank all of our speakers. Again, for those of you who did join us, located in the description, you will find additional resources where you can contact us, as well as links to our webpage. With that, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.